and thanks for joining us here at Fair Talk by Fair Farms. My name's Amanda Higgins. I'm really excited today to be discussing all things labour hire on our very first episode of Fair Talk. Joining me today is the Labour Hire Authority of Victoria Commissioner, Mr. Steve Dargavel. Steve, welcome.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here.
Thank you. So Steve, you've been the Commissioner of the Labour Hire Authority of Victoria since 2018, since it was first established. Prior to that, you were with the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union for 27 years, and 11 of that you were a State Secretary. And prior to that, you had a short stint in Parliament as a member of Fraser. And many, many moons ago, you were a youth worker and a youth refuge worker. So it seems to me that you have spent a lot of your career working and protecting vulnerable people. How did that career path come about?
It's fairness and equity in our community is something that brings meaning to me. Dignity for people is something that I find value in exploring and pursuing.
Yeah.
And I think it resonates with my values. And what I like about Fair Farms, it's a value-based proposition, and that's what I like working with and pursuing.
Yeah, fabulous. Excellent. Thank you. So we've got an interesting episode today. We're going to be discussing all things labour hire, and a little bit later on in the session, we will be going forth with some of the questions that have been submitted by our viewers. So I'd like to first of all get your understanding of how labour hire providers fit within the ethical sourcing within the horticulture supply chain, if I could.
Sure. I don't think it's controversial to say there's been a fair bit of evidence suggesting that not everything as it should be with the sourcing of labour through labour hire providers to industry, in a range of industries, not just horticultural, of course. Labour hire licensing is a proposition that has providers being licensed if they're doing the right thing and not licensed if they're not, and making it unlawful to deal with unlicensed providers. So it is consistent with and aligned with the objective of having an ethical sourcing proposition. A core objective of our Act in Victoria is to improve the integrity of the industry.
Yes, and that's an important thing to do, isn't it? It's one of those things. I think the Australian labour hire provider landscape has been likened to that of the gangmasters of the industrial era back in Britain. So I know that there was some studies referenced way back when, before Victoria regulations came in. And I have heard that there's talk of a national harmonised scheme, and we know that Queensland, Victoria, South Australia are regulated states. And I have heard that Victoria is going to be leading the way on the national harmonised scheme. Congratulations. Can you speak to a little bit about what that might look like, how that might impact on the labour hire providers who are operating in non-regulated states, and timeframes? When might that actually come to pass?
Sure. Firstly, the existing schemes are Victoria, Queensland, South Australia and the Australian Capital Territory. So there are 4 jurisdictions with schemes of various scale and scope, and the other jurisdictions are without a scheme. When Victoria sought to answer this challenge in the labour hire industry, it proposed there be a national approach, arguing that it wouldn't make sense for us to have all different approaches to the same topic throughout the Commonwealth. At that time, the Commonwealth were not minded to create a national solution back then. So 4 jurisdictions set up schemes, and the topic's been kicked around now in Australia for quite some time. There is now there's been a meeting of state, territory and Commonwealth ministers that have agreed that there'll be a national approach, and that will take some time to put together. But the principle is that there'll be a single national regulator. The labour hire providers will have a licence, and there will be a much more easy to understand set of rules that will generally be consistent across all of the Commonwealth of Australia, bringing in, of course, those jurisdictions that are not currently got a solution for labour hire.
No, that's. I think it's certainly a watch this space, and for those states who have regulations already, I think they'd probably consider it a welcome option to bring Australia into line and get some consistency throughout. I think that's where it will drive that, which will be wonderful. But Victoria is actually leading the way in regard to labour hire licensing. I think you've had a prosecution which had a record fine in excess of $617,000, and it's the highest fine for prosecution to Australian labour laws. I have a question that if that is the kind of fine which can be imposed, do businesses see it as a massive deterrent, or is it a cost of doing business?
So the principle of the labour hire licensing scheme is that flouting the rules in labour hire can't be a cost of doing business. So the Parliament's seen fit to have what are relatively significant penalties for breaches of the Labour Hire Licensing Act, and where we have focused our effort in terms of our prosecution strategy is to pursue providers that are just willfully seeking to bypass the laws, and sadly on occasion hosts with them colluding to do exactly that. So we've sought significant penalties. We haven't always sought significant penalties for every matter.
Okay.
Every case turns on its own merits, but where we see that really nasty, deliberate, egregious exploitation of workers, unlicensed providers, a conscious effort to bypass the rules and cheat, where the victims of that non-compliance, it's significant harms, then we will go hard and seek significant penalties. In other cases, we've sought more moderate penalties where the contraventions have not been as egregious. So it will turn on each individual case, and of course it's all subject to the court process. So it's not just us as a regulator and how hard we go with a particular matter, but it's properly subject to judicial review as it should be.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I do understand that in Victoria that host employers are bound and the same penalties can apply as what they would be for labour hire providers operating in an unlicensed manner. And I think just recently, back in December, there was a fine of in excess of $217,000 for a host employer for engaging with unlicensed providers. So it's certainly it seems whilst there is that fine and that prosecution at risk, it leads me to my next question for you, which is for growers who feel that they have no option, where they have a harvest and a crop that's ready to come off, where they have tried to hire employees directly and there's just not the numbers that they need in the period of time, and perhaps they've tried to also engage a licensed labour hire provider. If they know that the bank is knocking and they are absolutely over a barrel and that crop keeps the bank at bay, my question is, they are having to make a massive decision based on risk. Do they lose that crop and that harvest, or do they risk a fine? What would be your instruction to a grower having that as a consideration?
So when we started the labour hire licensing journey here in Victoria, but also a similar thing occurred in Queensland, which also has quite a similar scheme to Victoria's, there were a lot of questions like that, a lot of concern from farmers, and I did a lot of meetings with the industry where those sort of anxieties were expressed. The fact of the matter is that we have in Victoria over 5,500 licensed labour hire providers to use. In the Victorian horticultural industry, there is in excess of 550 providers just that are focusing on this industry. There's not a shortage of providers that are prepared to supply. There have been certainly some cases where farmers have had difficulties getting a licensed labour hire provider, and I've had a discussion with them about their circumstances, and generally what I've found is that where they've gone to the market with a supply contract that will only result in non-compliance, that is the amount they're prepared to pay for labour through a provider to get their crop off, is below the award.
Yes.
Then if the scheme is operating as intended, legitimate licensed labour hire providers will refuse to supply. And that as a consequence of the scheme, some primary producers have reviewed their supply contracts to ensure that they're compliant with their obligations, that there's enough money for award wages, there's enough money for super, and there's enough money for workers' comp and tax and so forth. So I've not yet come across a producer that's got a good supply contract that cannot source labour. This is essentially a concern that I absolutely understand at the start of a scheme. That's not been the lived experience either in Victoria or Queensland in our horticultural industry, where people just haven't been able to find labour who are prepared to pay properly for it.
No.
At least as a consequence of the licensing regime.
No, that's exactly right. And that's where that rigour is important around that. And speaking of the licensing scheme, we often hear this term called illegal phoenixing. So whilst you may have a licensed provider, there can be this phoenixing that goes on either as a subcontracting arrangement or as an alternate. Can you explain to us what is illegal phoenixing and what are some of the things that businesses should actually be aware of to look out for? That might be some telltale signs that that's occurring.
It's a really good question. Unfortunately, there are some folks in our country who use insolvency law as a way of manipulating the system. They might set up a company, it incurs debts to workers and other businesses, pop that business into administration or liquidation, have a similar naming entity that they'll then roll their business into, not pay the debts from the first, and rinse and repeat.
Right.
That type of cyclic, unlawful phoenix activity is a blight on everyone. It's a terrible thing for workers. It's a terrible thing for the creditors, the trade creditors. It's a terrible thing for the tax system. So, unfortunately, the labour hire industry has been an attractive place for people running unlawful phoenixing operations because there's cash turnover sometimes, there's certainly payroll turnover. So the Labour Hire Authority has been working together with other agencies as part of the Phoenix Task Force to disrupt and dismantle some of these phoenixing outfits. We have removed a significant number of entities from the industry that we have had concerns that they are involved in or proximate to phoenixing, unlawful phoenixing activity. So we've certainly made important progress with the licensing system in reducing and trying to tackle phoenixing, which has been impacting this industry, not just workers but also trade creditors and the taxation system generally.
Well, that's right. It impacts, that financial restraint or constraint then of that money not flowing through to other businesses certainly does impact the broader community at large, as well as the employees, as well as their entitlements, etc. So from a Labour Hire Authority Victoria perspective, do you have resources that are available to growers? And whilst knowing that you are Victorian as the Commissioner here, are those resources, do you think, able to be utilised across the rest of the state simply as a bit of a framework from an assistance point of view to understand what the due diligence or perhaps obligations would be for growers when they're wanting to engage with an LHP?
Sure. We've got a website, labourhireauthority.vic.gov.au.
It's a good one, by the way.
Easy to find, and we have resources especially for the horticultural industry, for hosts and labour hire providers and workers with guidance material. And we also put out a monthly e-newsletter to anyone who'd like to subscribe to that with updates and other resources. And we have a public register where everyone can go for free and find who is licensed, their direct contact details, the people who run the business, their ABN, ACN number. And what's really important about that register is that if you're trying to find a legitimate labour hire provider, and unfortunately there are providers that pretend that they're someone else or that they're licensed and they're not, you go to the single source of truth, which is the register, identify who you're dealing with, that the ABN number, the ACN number matches, that the phone number you're calling is the phone number that is on the public register for that business. So there are a lot of resources there for hosts, workers and providers. There's another tool there too. If you're interested in following the status of a licensed provider you're using, you can register your interest in that provider or any number of providers, and the system will generate an automatic alert for you if there is perhaps an imposition of a particular license condition on that provider, or if the license is cancelled.
Yeah, no, that's good. I've seen that actually as a mechanism, and I think that credit to you, because I find that that's probably one of the easiest sites to navigate and to use to be able to do license searches. That's wonderful from a grower perspective, but I also note that you recently have put out a number of resources for horticultural workers specifically as well. Would you like to speak to that? Because I know that there are a number of posters, brochures, booklets, etc., that have also been translated into a number of languages, and where workers might find that and the sort of content that they would be privy to should they be having those resources shared with them.
So we're very keen to hear from everyone involved in the industry, and our other primary objective, apart from improving the integrity of the industry, is to protect labour hire workers from exploitation. And so it's important that we speak to that audience in all of the languages that audience understands, and we hear directly from them their lived experience. So it's one thing to set up a compliance system and have investigations and have our checklists and all the rest of it, but where the rubber hits the road is, what is the lived experience for the workforce? Are people getting paid properly? Is there a health and safety system that makes sense? And we do get a lot of important information from workers about their experience. And sometimes that information is that they're actually seeing an improvement, which is good to hear. But concerningly, we still see some very significant concerns raised by workers, which we investigate and deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that that's fabulous, because we know that there are a lot of overseas workers that have come through either the Working Holiday Makers scheme, or that they've also come through from the PALM scheme as well. So how significant is labour hire provider and the PALM scheme? I know that they tend to dovetail in. There's a lot of labour hire providers who are engaged within PALM. Do you know what sort of numbers that might look like generally?
Yeah, PALM's got resources where they'll set out the scope of their activity and how many registered providers and obviously direct employers that they deal with. There are a lot of different temporary migrant workers working in the labour hire industry, and PALM is just one of many modalities of temporary migration that are apparent. And relative to the overall labour force, PALM is not a majority component of the overall labour supply profile in the horticultural industry and in the national economy. It's an important program, but for sure, but it doesn't represent anything like the majority of the labour supply that is going into the horticultural industry in Australia.
Excellent. Interesting. And certainly with PALM workers now being able to work and are accommodated in other industries as well, that those numbers are certainly diluted within the Horts side of things. Thank you. It's certainly an interesting topic, and labour hire is one of those that as a program we certainly come across, and we have a number of conversations with our members, and our important part is for them to, or our important message to our members is actually try and conduct some due diligence on your labour hire provider. And some of those questions that we have had come through from our audience today, if we can go through a couple of those, is what are their obligations when they're engaging with a labour hire provider? What should they be checking for? So what is the basic amount of due diligence that some host employer should be able to conduct on an LHP they're thinking of engaging? What would you suggest?
Great question. So firstly, there are a number of obligations which attach to hosts, whether or not there is a labour hire licensing system. So, we have a set of migration laws in this country which affect farmers just as much in New South Wales, where there is not a labour hire licensing scheme, as much as they affect farmers here in Victoria and up in Queensland. There is taxation laws. There is fair work laws and awards that apply, and there are vicarious liability provisions which just sit there at large, whether or not there is a labour hire licensing system. So they are concerns that all hosts have, whether or not there is a licensing system. And of course, occupational health and safety and the obligation to work with your supply chain and contractors and labour hire providers in your business to ensure people go home safe.
Yes.
So those obligations sit there. And engaging in labour hire providers, there's a couple of pieces of information we'd like people to consider very clearly. First, understand who you're dealing with. Validate on the public register that your licensed provider actually has a licence and that the provider that you think you're dealing with is actually the provider you're dealing with. And you can go to that public register and validate that the contact details you are using are actually sit against the public register that connect with that business. The second thing we really strongly encourage people to do is to consider the degree to which they want to tolerate pyramid contracting within their business.
Also known as subcontracting?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you might have a provider that is bringing in subcontract labour hire providers, often just called contractors in the hort industry, and they might be on contracting again. So you might have three tiers between what the farmer's funding and what the actual worker is getting, and three profit takes in between. The more opaque those layers are, the more challenging compliance is for the farmer. And we sort of question why farmers would not require their labour hire provider to be very clear about who they're dealing with. And we certainly encourage farmers to consider limiting the amount of on-subcontracting that occur without the farmer's knowledge and consent. We'd encourage people to reduce their arrangements to writing. A lot of these verbal arrangements, particularly where cash is involved, are connected with an enormous amount of risk and a significant amount of interest from regulators. If you're running on verbal arrangements and there's cash involved, you will expect regulators to be very interested because often those arrangements are unclear, opaque, and are often connected with pretty bad compliance performance. So written agreements that support you, you want your labour hire provider to be clear in their expectations and you're clear about their expectations. So a written agreement between the parties is a good place to start. And in terms of some questions relate to, well, how far can I go with asking for information from my provider and really how much is in my interest to go there? And look, we've seen a range of growers do things like require monthly payroll summary reports.
Yes.
Just to satisfy themselves that actually there are remittances, that super's being paid, that they're paying for in the contract, and they absolutely are entitled to expect a pass-through because they want workers who they're investing in upskilling, they're investing in their business, will actually return to their business next harvest. So there's a number of basic checks, and of course they should talk to Fair Farms as well as look at the support on our own website.
Yeah, thank you. I think some of the things that we tend to advise our members is to do the ABN check, to first and foremost see if they're licensed, if they're operating within a licensed state. Vivo checks. And then also too for Australian workers, whilst we might assume that they're Australian workers, it's handy to obviously have a birth certificate or a passport and those sorts of things to ensure that we're not engaging with an unlawful non-citizen, even though they might sound as Aussie as you and I, really. I think one of the primary things that we do get asked is, if a labour hire provider doesn't want to provide me with a copy of the pay slips that they're giving to their workers, do we have the right to insist upon those? And can we have that conversation with the labour hire employees to verify that they are actually getting paid accordingly? It does provide a level of discomfort for a certain number of our growers. We do hear that. My words are absolutely have that difficult conversation up front with the labour hire provider and let them know that that's the expectation. Would you think that that's an advisable thing to do? And do you think it happens to be a breach of privacy should a host wish to see pay slips being provided?
Firstly, the labour hire providers required by law to produce pay slips to workers.
Yes.
these are workers in your business. They might be employed through an intermediary, but this is your workforce.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely entitled to talk to your workforce and check in with them to see whether or not they're getting the basics. Are you getting a payslip? And it'll quickly become apparent if you're looking at payroll summary reports and that sort of thing, whether the basics are being attended to. I'd be asking the workers in your business, are you getting your wages in your bank account, or are you getting it paid to you in cash? If you're finding workers in your business are getting paid in cash, you've probably got a very strong indication that everything is not as it should be. And really consider raising a report to the authority. We have a report a problem webpage, and we'd love to hear from you if you're seeing that kind of thing in your business and you're uncomfortable about it. We're very happy to have awkward conversations, and we certainly have powers to come in and support you to ensure that everything as it should be. We want to support businesses that are doing the right thing, and we do have powers to, as a lot of business regulators do, to make that happen.
No, and I think that's a good thing to know. And I have done some research in regards to your annual report, and I do know that should a complaint be made where there is an imminent risk to health and safety, and a report has been lodged, that the LHA can actually send out investigators or officers, and a turnaround period has been as short as 24 hours. And we did speak earlier to that, and that's basically on a risk-based approach. For those people who would like to make a report as simply a matter of course without there being an imminent risk to someone, what would be the process for that to occur? And could that report be coming from anybody? And what would be a general time frame and how would that then be addressed by your people?
So firstly, if you go to our website, labourhighauthority.vic.gov.au, on the right-hand side, there's a little tab, and you can press on that, report a problem.
Yeah.
And you get a little web page, and you put in your details of what you want to report to us. We get a lot of problems reported to the regulator. And in fact, the majority of concerns raised with the regulator is not from workers, it's not from unions, it's not from hosts, it's actually from other labour hire providers about each other. And so quite sensibly, the Act limits how much information we can give back to people in terms of our inquiries, and that is just a normal sort of secrecy provision in business regulators have. We can't always give an update to people depending upon what we're investigating, as to how it's going, and some investigations do take a considerable period of time. Other matters will be dealt with very quickly, and it will depend on the circumstances and the quality of information we have. In a recent case, there was some very significant behaviour that was occurring in real time, and we felt that we needed to act quickly, and so we sought interlocutory relief from the Supreme Court of Victoria and sought a asset freezing order over the bank account of the business involved that was involved in quite egregious behaviour. So we are a regulator that is prepared to move quickly, but not in a reactive way. We do like to consider all of the information and be a proportionate regulator. So unfortunately, the answer is there isn't a single number that says in all cases we will turn around a matter in a fixed number of days. It will depend on how urgent it is, how good the information is. As I say, some investigations take a long time, and some matters can be turned around quite quickly.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So other than report a complaint or lodge a report here, what else is being done to stop rogue operators? If a lot of those reports are coming through from other licensed labour hire providers, I'm assuming, what activity is the LHA doing to stamp out rogue operators? And can you speak to the other states just in a general manner to be able to understand what they potentially are doing as well?
So we work in conjunction with a range of agencies and certainly other labour hire regulators in Australia, but also other state and Commonwealth agencies and, of course, police forces as well. So we work in conjunction to ensure that we're improving the integrity of the industry. There is always a need for a compliance and enforcement program with a litigation element to that program, but that is not to underestimate or undervalue how important it is just to talk to people and get around. So we do quite a lot of engagement in the community and seek to front up to regions and raise awareness of obligations and seek support for a lawful industry. So engagement, communication, education. In the licensing scheme itself, it's not just a matter of granting or refusing a license. It's also we use conditions on licenses where someone might be perhaps generally doing the right thing but needing a little bit of a tidy up, and you might introduce license conditions to just get them where they need to be.
I have seen those, and that might be submitting your payroll activity statement by the 7th of every month and that sort of stuff. It seems to be fairly common. One of the other questions that has come through from one of our viewers is, other than the initial outset from registration or license renewal, is there a monitoring process through that 3-year period at all? Do you do ad hoc checks, or is the scrutiny applied right at the very beginning upon application, or only upon renewal? Is there an oversight through that?
Absolutely. We're not a set and forget regulator. The granting of a licence is start of a journey, and we have a full suite of compliance and enforcement teams. We have a team for horticulture, and we're in and around businesses and dropping into regions, sometimes with foreshadowed visits and sometimes unannounced visits. So there's that kind of monitoring. There's also baked into the scheme is that labour hire providers who are licensed have to provide annual reporting to the authority, and we also monitor intelligence from a range of agencies. And so we have a risk model, and we consider the need for additional reporting in some areas where there are compliance concerns. So there's a whole range of activities that we undertake, but the core of it is talking to people, and we certainly have people out and about, but that's supported by back-of-house intel analytics systems, intelligence exchange with other agencies, and all the bells and whistles.
No, and that was actually going to be my next point with your interagency communications. If you do suspect that there is untoward behaviour occurring with an LHP, do you have a reporting mechanism that might flow into Fair Work Ombudsman, for example? So can you report to FWO if there are suspected non-compliances or definite non-compliances if you've had that reported through to you?
Yeah, the authority makes disclosures to all sorts of primary regulators, Fair Work Ombudsman, the ATO, Border Force, training regulators in relation to trainees and apprentices, occupational health and safety regulators. So there's quite a two-way flow of information. There are rules that surround the exchange of information, and it's always done lawfully and appropriately, and protecting people's data integrity. But yes, we do quite a bit of information exchange with other regulators. Yeah,
no, that's good to know. I have a specific question here that's about annualised contracts, if we could speak to that for one of our viewers. If a labour hire provider arranges an annualised contract promising 20 hours of work each week with the workers, but the worker doesn't turn up for work, is the host employer obliged to pay them for the full year, even when the worker does not turn up to work?
That's a great question.
It's a great question.
So firstly, I can't give legal advice on a contract I haven't seen, and would probably be loath to give legal advice about a contract I have seen for a farmer or a labour hire provider. But what I would say is that I have seen quite a few contracts between hosts and labour hire providers, and I can see within those contracts unenforceable terms. And there are certainly farmers that are signing contracts because they're just busy and they need to get stuff done, and you know,
not necessarily reading the fine print.
And perhaps, but then there are sometimes terms in those contracts which are pretty pretty ordinary, and there's been a string of decisions holding a number of these arrangements unenforceable. So look, if I was a primary producer and was asking questions like that, I'd speak to my lawyer about it, and I'd get some advice about really whether that makes any sense at all and whether it's enforceable. I have certainly seen providers seek to sign workers up to the premise that they're not allowed to accept employment from a host that they're supplied to, and I've seen contract provisions where labour hire providers try to get hosts to agree that they're going to pay some awful penalty for directly engaging a worker that they've been supplied to at some point. And there's a string of authorities that really cast a significant question about how enforceable those sort of provisions are. And so I'd speak to my lawyer and get some professional advice about the individual contract and whether, in fact, it's a problem for the farmer asking that question. I suspect it's not as big as they might be.
No, well, the employment relationship with a labour hire worker is with the labour hire provider. And that's where the employment contract sits. It doesn't speak to the dual responsibility when it comes to work health and safety, because the host employer as well as the labour hire provider both have a dual responsibility when it comes to WH&S. In your time with LHA, have you come across anything where businesses or hosts have been held to account from an accessorial liability or a vicarious liability where there has been perhaps an accident on farm, and whilst the employee or the worker is contracted to the LHP, the business has actually had to front court or undergo an investigation for contraventions of work health and safety? Have you had that in your experience so far?
Yeah, I've certainly seen prosecutions of hosts in respect to the conduct of labour hire providers where there's been regrettably a fatality. And that's occurred before there was a concept of a labour hire licensing regime in Victoria, and it continues today where hosts can be held to be accountable for health and safety on and within their business. The key thing here is that, and it's been crystallised with some amendments in the Victorian jurisdiction to make this very clear, that there's a positive obligation on hosts to work with and consult with their contractors and labour hire providers to ensure that there's a safe system of work for workers. And so we actively encourage people to do that, and we'll routinely be asking labour hire providers about what their safe system of work is. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens when there's a terrible thing that occurs in a workplace, such as a fatality, is that all of the assumptions people have used are tested. And sometimes a host will assume that a labour hire provider is doing something, and the labour hire provider assumes that the host is doing a thing. Now, there shouldn't be confusion about who is doing which role on occupational safety. Both the provider and the host both have responsibilities to ensure that work is done in a health and safety way. And whilst we test labour hire providers for their safe system of work, and we've certainly refused and cancelled licences over concerns on their failure to support a health and safety workplace, there's also that primary obligation also on hosts to ensure that the job is safe.
No, that's exactly right. That dual responsibility does fall on both shoulders, on both the grower and on the labour hire provider. And I think that the best way that anyone within that situation can protect themselves is to have a documented training plan of what inductions have been undertaken and what training in respect to safety on farm has occurred. So I think that that's a really good point. We've had a question from one of our big retailers who's asking, from the three big retailers, what can they do to help promote better labour hire provider behaviour? I know that we have responsible sourcing codes, we have labour hire addendums. Is there anything that you think that the big guys, the big retailers can do to help support better behaviour from LHPs through their supply chain. We know that they have to analyse risk from the modern slavery aspect to ensure that there is no worker exploitation, which obviously is what we're drilling down to here. But from your perspective, is there anything more that can be done? Or is it that enforcement the whole way through?
No, it's a combination of things that are needed. I think what a lot of primary producers would say to the business asking that question is make sure you pay a fair price.
Yeah.
In the same way that I was talking about a farmer or a group of farmers I was speaking to that didn't have a supply contract that could result in everything adding up at the end of the day and the work being paid properly. In the same way, supermarkets need to make sure that the supply chain is healthy and that the primary producer at the end of the day is getting a fair wicket to ensure that the crop can get off in a lawful way. So I think that wouldn't come as a surprise to any supermarket or large retail business to hear that feedback from primary producers.
It's a very topical point of discussion at the moment, isn't it?
But, there is some encouraging signs in the ABARE numbers about farm gate price in a range of crops improving, and it would be great to see that continue. Now, it's very important, I think, for those big retailers to be very clear in their communications with their supply chain that businesses supplying farms labour hire services need to be licensed, and it's not just the head contractor that needs to be licensed. Folks need to ensure that every business who is involved in supplying labour, whether it's a subby, a sub-subby, a prime, that they are all licensed.
What about a person who's out there recruiting? I often see on the Facebook backpacker pages and that sort of stuff that there might just be a single individual who's saying, hey, I've got some work on farm, we're paying X amount of dollars per hour, or we're paying a piece rate, etc. Does that individual, and this may vary state by state, must that individual hold a licence if they're actually out there recruiting for numbers?
So if someone is doing a placement service where they're helping farmers directly employ, just find people to directly employ, then that's fundamentally not a labour hire activity. But what is often happening is when we look at social media, whether we're talking about WeChat, a lot of the channels on WhatsApp, Facebook and all the rest of it, people are actually organising labour hire services using those platforms and not organising placement services.
Yes.
So we obviously monitor social media and are very interested in it. But no, if you're just doing placement, if you're just supporting businesses to hook them up with labour for them to directly employ, unless in Victoria you're doing that in conjunction with accommodation where there's some other issues at play. If you're just doing a placement service and you're not involved in managing the payroll and managing the person, then you're not a labour hire provider in the traditional sense. But where it gets more into the labour hire space is you've got someone doing the recruitment, they say, but they're also happen to be running the payroll and they're organising the transport. That in Victoria is going to be a labour hire provider.
That's right.
It's walking like a duck, it's quacking like a duck, and it's laying duck eggs.
I'm guessing it's a duck, right? Yeah, I agree with you. So the other question that's come through, and thank you to everybody who actually has submitted questions. We've been inundated with them, so it's really pleasing to see. Thank you very much. Should we audit the labour hire company to make sure they're doing the right thing? And I'll quickly jump in with a Fair Farms statement on that one to say that we have had actual approval by our board to increase our scope of certification to include provision of accreditation for certified labour hire providers. So that's something that hopefully will then be able to give our members another level of comfort that a labour hire provider has gone through a robust audit process that's done via a third party. But for those labour hire providers who perhaps need the resources and need the assistance to understand their obligations, that's a yes from me, just so we know. So I don't know whether you feel the same thing, whether another layer of compliance and auditing is of benefit, but I think particularly for those non-regulated states, it's a great starting point.
Yeah, look, there are a range of industries that have self-attestation or models, that pre-qualification models or other solutions, and anything that's purposeful that's going to improve the integrity of the supply of labour in the industry will be terrific for the industry in the long term. We get that people are busy in their businesses, and we get that folks want to ensure that these systems are purposeful and add value, and I'm sure that the work that Fair Farms will do will be purposeful and add value. We do consider a range of these systems in different industries, and sometimes they're helpful in improving compliance performance, and we're very encouraging of anything that's adding up to a fairer and more lawful industry.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Steve, I think we could talk about this for days on end, to be quite honest. It's a wide-ranging topic, and it certainly does impact so many people within Australia. I would very much like to say thank you. You do some wonderful engagement work around the place in Victoria. I know that you've got some engagement sessions coming up, one in Ballarat and Geelong. So I think if anyone in Victoria would like to attend those sessions, they'll be able to find them on your website. So that will be answering all things labour hire in a one-on-one room situation, which is always great. So if you would like further information, we have actually had a request for a best practice cheat sheet. I don't know if you would be happy to work with me, and if so, then we'll be able to post that on our Fair Farms website under our resources tab over the next few days. But Steve, I'd like to thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for your time and spending it with us here today. And I'd like to thank you all for joining me for our very first episode of Fair Talk with Fair Farms. And I will see you next month. Bye for now.